All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're stepping way outside the everyday and diving straight into the shadows. We are unpacking a truly grim, dark Gothic fable called The Architectures of Sterile Denial. It's this fascinating, haunting piece of philosophical storytelling that uses some pretty intense Nietzschean philosophy and some really cool linguistic roots to explore the psychological dangers of repressing our primal nature. Seriously, it's a total masterclass in understanding exactly what happens when we try to scrub away our own bleeding, messy, breathing humanity.
So, let's jump right into this haunting premise with our first major archetype, the Pale Inquisitor. Now, the Inquisitor is this figure who is absolutely desperate to codify and control the metaphorical stains of human existence. Listen to the imagery here. His hollow sockets act as a mirror reflecting a deep-seated inner terror of the unlived life. He is so terrified of the sheer chaos of living that he wields this razor-sharp quill, basically trying to carve absolute laws into being, just to protect himself from the world.
And that brings us to the target of his terrifying obsession, the honest guest. The honest guest, well, he represents us, you and me, our flawed, organic humanity. This guest carries the literal stench of the primal unconscious right into the middle of a sterile sanctuary, and he's caught in an absolute nightmare. He's trapped between two different but equally destructive so-called cures. On one side, the Inquisitor's razor-sharp quill, and on the other, the Redeemer's pink syrup. What the honest guest really represents is the agonizing but totally necessary process of shadow integration and psychological growth, meaning ultimately, he has to reject both the quill and the pink syrup to embrace authentic, messy tragedy.
Because here's the thing, both the Inquisitor and the Redeemer are offering completely failed psychological cures. They act as these two warring architectures of sterile denial. The Inquisitor demands perfect purity through this endless carving of laws and restrictions. And the Redeemer? He offers blissful numbness through complete psychic dissociation. But at the end of the day, both demand that you completely sacrifice your authentic self.
Let's look a little closer at the Inquisitor's method. Perfect purity. Sounds like an ideal, right? But here, it's a weapon. The Inquisitor uses his quill to carve laws to achieve absolute control, just searching endlessly for hidden faults. It's entirely paralyzing. The tragic irony is that in trying to purge all sin, he paralyzes the individual until literally no honest breath can be taken. It's a complete neurosis, driven by that fundamental terror of an unlived life we just talked about.
Now, the Redeemer takes a totally antithetical approach. He doesn't use a quill, he uses pink syrup. But to really get this, we need to look at the philology, the history of the language used in the fable. It revolves around the root word los, which means to loosen or detach. The Redeemer is essentially offering this sweet syrup that loosens the psyche from the burden of being. It turns a person into a beautiful monument, basically a smiling corpse, completely detached from the messy pulse of reality. After all, you can't be stressed if you're entirely hollowed out, right?
The source text actually gives us 4 distinct parables of pale redemption, diagnosing exactly how these methods of denial end in absolute tragedy. We get the ink-smeared saint, the singing metropolis, the weightless shroud, and the glass fortress. Each one takes a different method of denial, from black ink to sugar-coated syrup, and tracks it all the way to its horrifying conclusion.
And the horrific irony here is how each attempt to purge the human condition ends up violently consuming the subject. The ink-smeared saint dies having never truly lived. The singing metropolis drinks the syrup and turns into a city of rotting corpses with smiles plastered on their faces. The priest in his weightless shroud lacks the anchor of dirt and just gets blown into the void. And those scholars in their glass fortress, they build a masterpiece of control directly over a cavern of repressed, starving hunger.
To really wrap our heads around this philosophical deep dive, we have to constantly contrast these illusions against reality. The text contrasts the sterile, linguistic tools of denial, things like spotless linen, stained glass, dead languages, against the undeniable weight of organic reality, dirt, blood, the wild wind. Those sterile tools are just desperate attempts to construct an artificial certainty to block out organic truth.
Which leads us to a pretty vital question we really have to ask ourselves. When we drown out the growling of our own belly with Latin and dead languages, what exactly is waiting for us in the dark? Those scholars in the glass fortress thought they were perfectly safe, but the more they polished their pristine glass, the heavier the stench grew from beneath them. Because repressed nature doesn't just disappear, it ferments.
And then enter the truth-telling monster. This is the violent return of the repressed.
It crashes right through that stained glass and devours the sacred bread with bloody jaws, completely shattering that fragile illusion of sterility. This is the absolute climax of our Gothic fable, where all those artificial barriers are finally violently torn down.
Looking at the philological roots again, the word monster actually comes from monstrum, meaning an omen or a warning sign. So the monster isn't some external evil defiling the truth, not at all. It is the omen that was shoved under the floorboard so the Inquisitor and Redeemer could maintain their sterile dogmas. It actually has the courage to display its hunger on the outside, acting as a warning of the wild wind of reality that you just can't shut out forever.
This brings us to the ultimate synthesis of the whole story. The monster is simply the shadow that the Inquisitor and Redeemer desperately tried to carve away or numb into oblivion. Much like the honest guest, we have to accept this monster. It's simply the part of our human truth that we deemed filthy. Rejecting the Redeemer's pink syrup in favor of this authentic tragedy is literally the only way to remain whole.
Philosophically, we are standing at a precipice here, heavily drawing on Nietzschean concepts. On one side, we have Faust, the tight, rigid, defensive fist of control. It's the neurotic defense mechanism of those trying to dominate and sanitize existence. And on the other side, Whelil, the sweeping, unstoppable, cold, wild wind of life. The fist of control is exposed as nothing more than an incredibly fragile shield against the true, untamed force of reality.
And this maps perfectly onto what we can view as the Clockwork Sovereign trial. The obsessive quest for absolute sovereignty through all these sterile methods, utilizing gears of perfect data, processing flawless logic, administering the numbing effects of pink syrup, it doesn't lead to perfection. Actually, scratch that. It walks us straight into digital decay and psychic death. Trying to control every single variable of life systematically destroys the essence of life itself.
This metaphor right here perfectly captures the tragedy of the Clockwork Sovereign. You become the most expensive clock in an empty room, ticking perfectly, completely flawless, and utterly pointless. Compare that digital decay with the fool's psychic openness. The fool is willing to step into the mud, to feel the wind, to be a messy, honest guest in the world, rather than a flawless machine in a dead, empty room.
So, the huge takeaway from this explainer is the concept of proportional depth. The text explicitly warns us that sovereignty and dirt are proportional. The higher your palace of mirrors climbs toward perfect purity, the deeper its foundations absolutely must plunge into the dirt of the primal unconscious. You just can't build high without digging deep into the dark. To avoid these tragic fates, we have to integrate the shadow. The shadow is totally inseparable from the substance. Attempting to loosen yourself from tragedy, like the Redeemer suggests, is literal self-destruction. Authentic psychological growth means we have to acknowledge our underground twin. Acknowledging our innate messiness isn't a failure, guys. It is the absolute prerequisite for genuine life. I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought based on the monster's warning. Acknowledge your hunger or be crushed by the darkness you tried to purge. Will you embrace the vital, messy tragedy of your own humanity like the honest guest? Or will you let the architecture of sterile denial become your tomb? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into the shadows. Keep questioning and keep learning.